2, 3, 1.
Ooh.
Fuck this thing. We're here. Muscle and Feels Wolfpack podcast. Yeah, bitch.
Check.
YouTube will censor it.
Fucked it now. We fucked it.
It's okay. Now we can curse for the rest of the episode. All right. We are here with Milo Wolf in the trenches, in the trap house, in the crack den of Southampton, where Milo conducts his business and cooks crack. This is one of those episodes, so welcome.
Shout out to HMRC.
Shout out to HMRC, our friends over there, making sure we are doing things. Okay.
Supporting society, £1 at a time.
60
Taxes.
60 inside jokes aside, welcome to Muscle and Feels podcast. And today's topic will be deloads, which surprisingly we haven't really talked about, even though we have done, we have done the first study ever, I think, to talk about deloads, especially deloads for strength and physique
That was
sports.
the worst flex I've ever heard.
Why?
First study on deloads ever. First study ever, I think, on deloads, maybe?
Because I was going to flex very aggressively, and then I was
Go
like...
for it. No, do it.
Let's
This is
be
the Muscle and Feels
first,
podcast. This isn't Trauma by Science
Listen,
podcast.
first deload study in strength and physique sports ever. Where's your God now?
Listen, son.
Science, sir.
This shit is real. We're in the trap house as we speak.
We're in the trenches. But no, in all seriousness, it was the first study on deloads ever. Obviously, it wasn't just me and Milo. If anything, it was a lot of other people as well. Lee Bell, lead author, lead daddy on the study. Shout out to Lee Bell from Sheffield Hallam University. And a bunch of other people as well. Namely, now I have to say everyone. David Nolan,
Velu. Shout out to Velu.
Jack Dallamore.
Mm-hmm. I think that's it.
You, me.
That's it.
That's it?
That's the team.
Helms and Eric Helms.
He helped, yes, but he didn't want to be an author, did he?
No, he did.
Oh, damn.
He was an author.
Oh, he was an author.
Let's see. Let's confirm it.
Let's confirm it live.
Yeah, no, he was.
Eric Helms has
he
this
was
thing.
100%.
Eric Helms has this thing where he's just way too nice and ethical for me. He'll help on papers, but ask not to be an author.
He was because he did contribute massively to the data collection.
Yeah.
But because we have done so there's this study, and there's also the survey study, and there's also the Delphi survey study. I was like, okay, wait, am I forgetting something? So yeah, it was exactly everybody I said: Lee Bell, David Nolan, Velu, Imonen, Eric Helms, Jake Dallamore, Milo Wolf, and myself. So first study ever on deloads in strength and physique sports. Essentially interviewed a bunch of people, a bunch of strength coaches, strength and physique sport coaches to be precise. Really experienced strength and physique sport coaches, people that have coached some of the best powerlifters, if not the best in the world. Hint, hint. Some of the best bodybuilders as well, strongmen, Olympic weightlifting athletes actually competing at an Olympic weightlifting level, a lot of athletes competing at the highest level in the sport. And the reason behind the study was to see, hey, deloads, what are they? How are they used? How can we implement them? Potential discrepancies between coaches, and just arrive at a first sort of base for future research to be based on.
A lot of super based around it.
Super based. And also to provide some practical recommendations for coaches and athletes with a pinch of salt. The pinch of salt is mostly expressed because this was an interview study, and it's not like we have any intervention data to essentially go by, but that's changing soon. Max Coleman over at Lehman College in the Bronx, in New York. Dr. Brad Schoenfeld's lab.
The Bronx still sounds to me like it's the worst place on earth, but then I remember that it's not that anymore.
I think that's because we are hip hop heads,
yeah,
and because
we're from the Bronx. You know?
we watch a lot of documentaries and shows about hip hop, and they all sort of go back to the fact that the Bronx was dangerous. I'm not sure if it's still dangerous.
Living in a trap house does to you, you know.
That's it. Milo Wolf,
hip hop.
The Austrian trapper, the trappest trapper of the year. Shout out Nines. So wait a second. Deloads study 1, interview study. There was also a survey study that has not been published yet. We got around 200 and 90 responses.
Rookie numbers, chief.
Rookie numbers, that's true. Actually, 33% completion rate with 800 starts. I checked that yesterday because we're
People
doing
that don't
something
want
else.
to finish.
And also a Delphi study that is currently ongoing. By the time this is out, the first round will be over. So
Sorry,
I'm not going to
chief.
advertise.
What the fuck is a Delphi study?
A Delphi study is essentially a study that uses the Delphi technique. I'm not going to go into much detail on what that entails, but essentially it is a study that is trying to establish expert consensus, and it is much more than just your typical survey like the one we did before. So it's a very long first survey that includes a lot of open-ended questions for participants to respond to. And then from those questions, other questions are formed for round 2 and so on and so forth, so that then we can have a published paper essentially outlining the expert consensus around deloads, their definitions, their use, etc. But its methodology is much more rigorous and official than just a survey study that is more descriptive in nature. And in other fields, even in healthcare, in many fields, healthcare,
Like, who cares?
exactly.
All I care about is these guns, baby.
Yes,
Let's fucking go.
and yeah, they've had plenty of Delphi studies to just go over to establish expert consensus. Max Coleman, who's doing the first deload intervention study in the world, is also involved on the Delphi study.
Tell us a bit more about the study then.
I shall tell you a bit more about the study. So obviously, terms and conditions apply. Just some general info. 9 weeks of training, 2 groups. One group will train for 9 weeks. The other group will train for 4 weeks, detrain for 1 week, and then train for the rest of the 4 weeks. And there will be measurements for hypertrophy and various measurements for strength. The training they will follow will be lower body only, and they will be given an upper body program to follow on their own.
Excellent. That sounds pretty good.
Obviously, a lot of crucial details not included, but I'd rather keep those for when the study is actually over, and we can potentially invite the lead author and the person who is who's essentially the study itself, Max Coleman.
Indeed. Cool. What about the interview study that we conducted?
Of course. So, as I said, plenty of very experienced strength and physique coaches were interviewed. They didn't come anywhere. And we asked them a bunch of questions on deloads, their applicability, the definition of deloads, and how. And there were other questions on whether we think they think they're necessary, and so on and so forth.
So, I guess the way we could best go about this would be for you to tell me, all right, what is a deload? Where do you think, based on the data we have from these coaches and athletes, where do you think it's best used, et cetera, et cetera? Try and talk me through it.
Deload is essentially an easy week. What was the other one?
Should you use it? When do you use it? How do people use it?
To lower fatigue. I'm joking. I'm making this voice because essentially the findings of the study, they were interesting, but at the same time they really confirmed most of the things that we were already doing and already knew. But okay, to answer seriously, a deload, and I wanted to pull up the paper so I can use some quotes, but obviously because we don't have a computer in front of us, I will have to use my phone, just because it was an interview study and it's not like we measured something besides the input of the
But it's still
participants.
interesting to know what practitioners and high-level practitioners of the sports that we care about
For sure.
actually do. And so I think this study is a good foundation for future research,
It
such
is.
as the study that's about to come out.
It is, and at the same time, look, let's say you're sitting there, dinner table, classic Tuesday night argument with your family about deloads. Your younger brother is telling you, no, this is the way you should deload. I heard
For real, bussin'.
ex-jackass on YouTube say you have to do it this
TikTok.
way.
No,
And then you're
YouTube,
like,
Grandpa.
no, listen, younger brother. I read this paper by Lee Bell et al., aka by Bell et al., called, and the title is quite creative as well. You can't shoot another bullet until you've reloaded the gun. Coaches' perceptions, practices, and experiences of deloading in strength and physique sports. And you can be like, hey, brother, I read this paper, which essentially included interviews with 18 extremely experienced strength and physique sport coaches, some of them PhDs as well in relevant fields, and the consensus here was that deloads are an intentional period of reduced training difficulty, or a period of intentionally reduced training stimulus, or a temporary intentional reduction in workload. Essentially an easy week. Now, one thing that was important to sort of clarify was the difference between a deload and a taper, because tapers are usually are used in strength sports and other sports to prepare you for a specific competition and essentially allow you to perform at your best on said competition day. And many people use the term interchangeably. That even happened during the interviews. So people that differentiated between deloads and tapers then proceeded to use the word taper for deloads, even though they themselves had said it's different. So a taper would specifically be prior to a competition. A deload is something that you do as part of the training process. A taper is something you do immediately prior to a competition. And a taper is planned, whereas a deload is not necessarily planned. And it was funny that when looking at the interchangeability of those terms, the people that used both, they used taper to describe deloads, were individuals who had a strength sport background, meaning they had used that more. That's an observation that I made because
and I mean, to be fair, from my experience as well, most people outside of strength sports don't really know what a taper is,
for sure,
unless they're into strength conditioning or something.
Yeah.
You know, so like in bodybuilding, no one talks about a taper ever.
So to make things a bit simpler, I will just go over some of like the practical takeaways here instead of breaking down each category and really diving into the quotes of the participants. One, because it's essentially the same, it's more applicable, and at the same time, I think it does a tiny bit of a disservice to the paper, unless we spend a couple of hours now going over it, like I've done on previous podcasts. I think you should go and read the paper if you want to dive into the actual details. But I also want us to talk briefly about our application of deloads with our own training, but also with clients training, because at this point combined we've worked with hundreds of clients for sure,
maybe close to 1,000 at some point,
maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, so as far as manipulating training parameters for deloads, training volume is one of the main things that was mentioned by the coaches and should be reduced to anywhere between 30 to 50% in order to facilitate recovery. The same goes with training intensity. That, and by intensity I mean intensity of effort, proximity to failure. So adding 1 to 3 reps in reserve to most things and making training overall easier was something that was also expressed by the practitioners interviewed. Another way to do that would be to decrease the amount of reps you're doing and maintain the same load, but overall training volume, intensity of effort, and load need to be reduced one way or another to make things relatively easy. So deloads need to be an easy week where you can go in the gym, still do some training, etc. As far as frequency goes, most practitioners said that they wouldn't necessarily change, make any huge changes to training frequency, with some saying that, you know, if somebody wanted to take a day off here and there, they could, but the overall consensus was that you shouldn't change training frequency. Now, as far as duration, most people said that a deload will be around a week. Some said, hey, it could be shorter, it could be 5 days, or it could be body part specific. And not lastly, actually, as far as exercise selection goes, people said that you can use deloads in order to experiment with different exercises, but being careful of selecting exercises that are not too novel to the point where they may induce unwanted fatigue. So let's say you've never done an RDL. You weren't doing RDLs.
Or good mornings, or
good mornings, or an exercise with a loaded eccentric, and you're doing a deload and you do the exercise for the first time. They're not going to be the end of the world, but they may be unnecessarily fatiguing you. But at the same time, you can still play around with close variations of an exercise. So let's say you're doing high bar squat, you could potentially do safety bar squat, and again, keeping in mind that your training should be easy overall. But lastly, for as far as periodicity goes, and I'll just directly read from the paper now, for pre-planned training programs, deloading can be scheduled every 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the demands of one's training. And that may be advantageous in scenarios where you have a specific event or something that will be happening in your life, and that's me mostly speaking from a coaching perspective. And then, as far as non-pre-planned deloads, deloading whenever you're feeling fatigued, when training performance has started regressing, and when things are just not moving in the right direction, may be your best choice. A very, very brief overview of the findings of the study. And as I said, they do reflect a lot of the stuff that we already know. So there wasn't anything extremely odd that came out of the results.
So what I'm interested in now, after this overview, is obviously this overview gives us a very sort of broad set of guidelines for what's being done, right? Obviously, in the future, hopefully, we'll get some research on maybe, comparing different deload protocols to see what seems more effective, but that'll certainly take a lot of time to determine. So, for example, comparing, say, 7 days versus 4 days or something like that. And then over time, we can sort of inch closer to what a good or perfect deload would look like.
Yep.
For the time being, I guess, from a more practical perspective, how do you typically implement deloads with clients?
Yep.
What do those look like? Because obviously, this gives us an idea of what practitioners at large do on average.
Yep.
But it would still be interesting to know, okay, how do we apply all this in practice?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the main thing that I took away from the study was that, hey, nobody replied or nobody made a point of deloads needing to be extremely meticulously planned or having to pay attention to a ton of details. And again, like the overarching theme was an easy week of training where you're doing less volume and you're not training as intensely and you're not doing anything too crazy. So that sort of reinforced the idea that, hey, as long as we take an easy week at some point when the athlete or the individual is fatigued, then it doesn't matter a whole lot if he does 40% less training volume or 47 or 50, as long as it's easy and as long as the feedback at the end of the week is that, hey, I'm feeling good, and then that's reflected with other weeks. So I'm very reactive with my deloads unless there's a specific event or period of time coming up where the athlete or individual won't be able to train. So I had somebody recently say, hey, I'll be going away for a cruise in the next few weeks. I think it was 4 or 5 weeks. Mm-hmm. Shall we push until then and deload? And I was like, yeah, sure. For every other athlete, the moment their feedback changes to, performance regressed heavily this week, I'm feeling fatigued, they may miss a session, soreness is up, sleep is affected. As soon as I start seeing that trend, we usually take a deload. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we may hold on until the end of that week. So if at the beginning of the week, Milo tells me, hey, Pac, my squat session was horrible. This felt heavy. The other felt heavy. I couldn't do all the exercises. I will probably say,
my lengthened partials.
Yeah,
they felt terrible.
I will probably say, hey, let's give it a couple more sessions and then judge then. But if that trend continues, I'll take a deload. But sometimes it ends up being a blip where people will say, oh, I had a bad session and this hurts and the other hurts, and then a couple of sessions later, everything is feeling amazing, and then we're able to push for another week. Also, psychological fatigue is another reason.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting because I actually read a book by Renaissance Periodization a few years ago now called How Much Should I Train? Mm-hmm. And that book is mostly focused on how can we assess fatigue in someone and essentially the need for a deload or for a recovery phase or what have you. Mm-hmm. And some of the things that you discussed, like, psychologically they're feeling off, or their sleep gets worse, or they perform worse, etc. Those are indicators ultimately of recovery, and they can be kind of classified or categorized into like leading indicators that sort of happen before recovery is really taking a hit, concurrent or like simultaneous ones,
and other big words,
and then finally like lagging ones where once you see this happening,
that's true.
You've been fucked already. And so I think oftentimes with clients, what I see, to be honest, is that if we deload when they've had like a full week of bad training, it's probably a bit too late, and they still typically, even after a deload week, will carry some psychological fatigue where they didn't enjoy that training so much. Yeah. And so oftentimes, if there's a couple training days in a row where their performance is worse, where they feel worse, etc., I will be like, okay, let's deload. Like I'd rather be a bit on the front end of things than on the back end of things. Yeah. Ultimately, for some clients, it doesn't really matter. But I think for a lot of clients, the psychological fatigue that comes with, I just had a whole week of bad training, can actually be quite rough.
Yep, I totally agree, and it's nice because I do something similar depending on the type of client and their personality. I have some clients who are who are really emotionally disconnected, at least to a certain extent, from their training.
Mm-hmm.
If a training session goes bad, they report it, they're fine, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, these are mostly clients that I've worked with for a long period of time. With others, it's exactly what you said. If I see that for a couple of sessions things are going badly and overall their feedback is very negative,
Mm-hmm.
it may be that we still do the rest of the week, but I've already decided on deloading
Deload
the next
after,
week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Awesome.
no, 100%. And I think, to be honest, like I can see the value in, for example, body part specific deloads, but I think we're quite far away from having any sort of evidence on the topic for me to be like, oh yeah, definitely best option ever. I think mechanistically or like as a rationale, it makes sense, right? Like for example, your biceps could be very fatigued from doing 30 sets of biceps a week, whereas your back might actually be fine, and so
Yeah.
forth. But then part of me thinks we're so far from having any clarity on what sort of deload works best that I wouldn't be happy implementing them, especially considering, to be honest, how much of a pain in the ass they are to plan when you think about it.
Yeah, exactly. And
Like that requires an extreme level of attentiveness to feedback, an extreme level of planning, an extreme level of like, okay, let's divide up training into each individual muscle group, like even like, okay, side delts and rear delts.
Yeah.
Like you have to draw a line somewhere, and I think generally the guidelines proposed by practitioners here will have you in the right direction.
Exactly.
And there's one study that already exists. It's not exactly deloads, but I like to use it as like a, I don't know a ton about this area of research, but I know some stuff. And I know this one study, for example.
In Japan?
Yes. The 18-week study, where basically they had two groups. One group trained for 18 weeks straight using the same program, and the second group trained for 6 weeks, then took 3 weeks off training entirely. So training cessation, the same thing described in the upcoming study by Coleman. Is that right? Coleman in the Bronx.
Jawohl.
So 6 weeks on, 3 weeks off, 6 weeks on, 3 weeks off, versus training for 18 weeks straight. And what you saw in terms of muscle growth is that by the end of those 18 weeks, both groups had similar amounts of muscle growth. Likewise for strength. The interesting thing is, during the 3 weeks of training cessation, the participants' muscle size and strength declined slightly. So they measured it after 6 weeks and then after 9 weeks. So at the start of the training cessation period and at the end of the training cessation period. And yeah, you saw some regression in their muscle size and their strength. But then that was followed up by slightly faster adaptations in muscle growth and strength as well. So there might be something going on there as far as either resensitization physiologically, where they see an improved response in muscle growth or strength following a period of not training as hard. Or it might just be, for example, that psychologically, after a few weeks break, you feel like training hard again, you put more effort in, and maybe that more effort led to greater stimulus and to greater muscle growth following that. Whereas if you trained 18 weeks straight, by week 12, you're kind of like, okay, well, give me a break here. And so I think that study to me suggests, okay, well, look, at the very worst, taking a deload every 4 to 10 weeks, something like that, is probably not going to hurt you. It may even benefit you slightly.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I think as long as you're somewhere within that ballpark, honestly, nowadays, for busier people, it's almost always constraint-based. So, for example, they're going on holidays, or they won't have access to a gym. And so even if we tried to make their training effective, we'd probably just end up at maintenance or a very awkward position anyways. And so oftentimes for those people, it's very constraint-based. Whereas for myself, for example, unless I have a holiday planned, I will generally auto-regulate it when I'm like, oh, okay, soreness has been quite high. I can't really cope with the time demands of actually training hard right now. Or my performance has been going down for more than a few sessions in a row. Because, one thing to mention is performance-wise, if you only have one bad session, that can happen pretty often. And that doesn't mean that you should deload right away.
Yep.
That can be pulling the trigger a bit too early, to stick with the gut analogy.
Yep, exactly. And also, I think what, again, this research, the outcomes of this study highlight is the lack of, not the lack, but the fact that you don't need to be insanely meticulous with your deloading practices, and an easier week of training, no matter what that looks like, as long as, it's less, you're doing less volume and you're not training as intensely, will cover you. And it's you shouldn't worry too much about it, especially with the literature that you just mentioned. Even if that week ends up being a week where you're not doing anything, it's probably not. It's probably far from the end of the world, but might even be beneficial.
100%. And especially considering that in this study it was training cessation, right? And they only saw some decline in muscle size and muscle strength. Whereas if you were actually training during the time at all, and the research we have on how much training is required to maintain muscle size and muscle strength, and even other fitness characteristics like endurance, etc., indicates that, cool, you can slash your volume or the amount of training you do overall by up to like 2/3 or even more.
Yeah.
I think some studies indicate as little as like 1/8 or something. So realistically, you can divide your volume by something like between 3 and like 5 easily, and you would still be maintaining your muscle size and muscle strength pretty well for most people. And so if you do that, and you only do a deload every 5 to 10 weeks, for example, you can be almost certain that you're probably benefiting from it, and at the very worst, not losing out on anything.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure. What will be interesting to see in the coming years is whether the week off versus a week of training makes sense, especially for just a week off, right? Whether there's a big difference there. I suspect there won't be.
Yeah, that's my hunch as well. I think we won't find a super clear answer for that in a while because the differences will be too small to detect easily.
Yeah.
And we don't have big enough sample sizes in most studies to detect that. And honestly, like nowadays, you mentioned that some coaches and practitioners said, "Oh, I like to keep frequency consistent for the most part."
Yeah.
Or
they don't manipulate it because they don't like.
There's no point.
It doesn't matter. Yeah.
Yeah. For me, I usually do manipulate it just because, like, if you slash volume quite heavily, if they still go to train, say 4 days a week, that means oftentimes their sessions take like 30 minutes. And it's kind of a waste of their time to go into the gym to train for 30 minutes. Oftentimes, like it takes you, 15 minutes to get there, 15 minutes to get back, to have to shower, to have to get dressed, etc. And so I'd rather condense that training into 2 days. But I can see a case for sort of more frequent exposure to the movement patterns, etc., being a bit less rusty when you come back. But I think broadly speaking, you can also condense the training down, and it makes for a less stressful week, not just in terms of physiologically the training stimulus or stress, but it also makes training fit into their lifestyle a little bit better, and they have more time either to relax, either to do some work or catch up on any work that they didn't get quite around to because, for example, training time was higher last week, or that sort of stuff. It can be quite nice to reduce training time demands as well to allow for a stress reduction overall.
Yeah, for sure. And those were the guidelines those reflect the guidelines I gave a client yesterday, actually, who said they will be deloading. Well, we agreed on deloading next week and said they'd be happy to freestyle it. And I said, hey, if you don't feel like training as frequently as usual, feel free to take a day or two off. Yeah. I'd say you could even take the whole week off if you want. But overall, the guideline here is do much less than you'd usually do. Just cut every set in half, as in like cut the sets for each exercise in half. Add 2 to 3 reps in reserve, and if you just want to go and do 2 of the 4 days because his program kind of involves a more full body approach, then feel free to do so.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I think, and this is speculating a little bit, I think the reason why a lot of these differences get washed out, like for example, whether you do your usual 4 days a week or 2 days a week, or whether you take it fully off versus doing 2 days a week, I think the reason why a lot of these smaller differences in approach might wash out potentially, and why we might not be able to see differences in future intervention studies, is because, for example, taking the week fully off may result in slightly better psychological recovery or slightly better resensitization to training, but at the expense of, okay, maybe you lost a bit of muscle. And so overall, in the long term, it kind of washes itself out. And so I think a lot of these smaller differences in how you deload wind up not mattering because it then results in downstream effects that even it out.
Yeah.
And so I think that's probably also why the results of the interview study were quite broad in a way, and they were not like, oh, we need to deload exactly this way, exactly at this frequency, etc.
Sure. That's a good point. And it's important to note that the individual preferences of the athlete or individual that you're working with matter too, because for one person, a whole week off may be psychologically really relaxing. For another person, not doing anything for a whole week may feel like they're a waste of time or may cause some anxiety in regards to maintaining muscle. And I'd rather have them, even though I know that they're not going to lose a significant amount of muscle in a week of no training, I would rather not have to. I'm not going to try and convince them. I will say, hey, you're not going to lose any muscle if you take the whole week off, but I'm happy for you to do some training to feel like you're still active.
Talk to them,
With the classic, with the odd client here and there where you see the deload week training and it's like, bro, that was an RP9 squat AMRAP.
Usually it's the opposite though.
Usually it's the opposite.
Yeah, usually it's the opposite where like, okay, you prescribe an RP9 set and you see it, you're like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
That was an RP6.
That's true.
Cool. I think we covered that pretty well. I think we did the topic of deloads justice.
Yes, please check the full paper. Again, it's didn't want to do a disservice to the paper, but at the end there's a really nice table, essentially where I read from, summarizing the practical takeaways for coaches,
100%.
practitioners, and athletes.
I want to end this episode by giving a shout out to HMRC and a shout out to Paul Carter from Lift Run Bang.
Shout out to Paul Carter. We love you, bro.
Love you.
Peace.
Much love. Great back.
Right back.
Peace.